Russia is going to invade Europe again, that we're back to that World War II argument, which was nonsense in the first place.
Yes.
So here, Russia wants Ukraine, and then they're going to go for Poland. That's what Kamala Harris said at one point. That's
yes.
the stupidest statement I've ever heard, I think, from a political leader. Just ignorant, no education, no history.
What do you think accounts for, big picture, the hostility of NATO and Europe to Russia? What is that?
It's got to be education. It's got to be propaganda. They believe these things. The woman who runs the EU, Ursula, she constantly says these things that are ignorant of what's happened in the last 20, 30 years. They're ignorant of what happened in the 90s in Russia. They're not taking this into account. I talked to Macron at one point, and he was a very reasonable man. I thought he was saying things like,
As the third year of the Russia-Ukraine conflict draws to a close, the trajectory of the fighting has shifted decisively. At the start of 2024, Kiev and its Western sponsors aimed to stay on the defensive, hoping to exhaust Moscow's forces and create a stalemate. Ukraine's goal was to prove it could still mount resistance, while Russia focused on systematically degrading the opponent's military capabilities and infrastructure. The 2024 year as a whole, however, brought significant developments on the battlefield that highlight the changing dynamics of the conflict. On February 18th, the prolonged Battle of Avdiivka, a fortified Ukrainian stronghold, finally ended. A heavily industrialized suburb of Donetsk, the city had remained a key defensive position in Kiev since 2014, when it battled local separatists. With its hilltop location, high-rise construction, and underground infrastructure, it was a near-ideal defensive position. Initially, Russian forces attempted a classic encirclement strategy, advancing along the Berditsy-Orlovka-Vodyanoye line. However, this approach failed due to the effectiveness of Ukrainian drones, modern communications, and precision weaponry. Acknowledging the inefficiency of earlier methods, Russian commanders switched to small assault groups, focusing on exhausting the garrison over 4 months. In February, Russian forces broke into Avdiivka's center, splitting the town in half and forcing Ukrainian troops to retreat. The capture of the Avdiivka Koksokym plant, a large industrial facility comparable to Mariupol's Azovstal, signaled the end of the battle. Under new commander Alexander Syrsky, Kiev's forces displayed a pattern of holding out until the last moment, followed by disorganized retreats that caused heavy losses. This victory was emblematic of Russia's evolving strategy. The use of small, mobile units supported by heavy artillery and aerial surveillance allowed its forces to gradually dismantle entrenched Ukrainian defenses. While the capture of Avdiivka was a localized success, it also demonstrated the limits of traditional offensive methods in modern warfare, where technology and precision weaponry heavily favors defenders. So today's video will focus on the evolving battlefield strategies of the Russian armed forces that crippled the Ukrainian defenses in 2024, and will assess whether this trend can continue in 2025. One of the many results of these strategies is the recent breakthrough at Lyman, which few have covered, but which I will talk about today. Much of the footage in this video has been edited to remove the graphic parts, but the full, uncensored versions are available to channel members in the Brutal Combat Footage tier of membership. I suggest that you watch the introductory video I have created in the end screen and consider joining the exclusive channel community to gain access. Lastly, a quick shout out to all my newest channel members. And with that, let's get into it. As the positional nature of the conflict deepened, both sides escalated long-range strikes. Ukraine relied on NATO-supplied missiles and domestically produced drones to target Russian cities and infrastructure. These UAVs, with ranges exceeding 1,500 kilometers, struck deep into Russian territory, causing periodic fires and damage to fuel depots and refineries. In response, Moscow launched systematic strikes on Ukraine's energy grid. By April of 2024, 5 of the country's 7 major thermal power plants and several hydroelectric facilities had been destroyed. While Ukraine managed to stabilize its grid with imports from neighboring countries, the energy system remained precariously close to collapse. Russia's missile attacks became increasingly sophisticated. Multi-day operations involved decoy drones and hypersonic strikes to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. These attacks targeted not only energy infrastructure but also key military installations, forcing Kiev to divert resources to protect its rare areas. The Ukrainian population's frustration with claims about the supposed success of their air defenses, often perceived as exaggerated, became increasingly evident on social media. By mid-year, Moscow had also adapted to counter Kiev's drone strikes. Using a combination of radar systems, electronic warfare, and mobile interception teams, Russian forces significantly reduced the effectiveness of Ukraine's long-range drone campaigns. Despite this, the war of attrition continued to take its toll on both sides, with civilian infrastructure and morale suffering heavily. In August, Ukraine launched an unexpected offensive into Russia's Kursk region, targeting poorly defended border areas. Ukrainian brigades used light armored vehicles and local numerical superiority to occupy roughly 1,000 square kilometers of sparsely populated territory, including the small town of Sudzha. The operation's initial success created a media frenzy, with Western outlets hailing it as evidence of Ukraine's continued capability to strike back. However, the strategic impact was limited. The Ukrainian forces faced logistical challenges and heavy resistance from Russian reinforcements. By autumn, Russian counterattacks had reduced Ukraine's territorial gains by half. One notable aspect of the Kursk offensive was its impact on Ukrainian resources. The operation required the deployment of elite brigades, which was sorely missed on other fronts. While the offensive temporarily boosted morale and media narratives, it ultimately diverted attention and manpower from more critical battles in Donbass and Zaporizhia. For Russia, the Kursk incursion highlighted vulnerabilities along its border regions. In response, Moscow accelerated efforts to fortify these areas, deploying additional troops and constructing defensive structures. The operation also reinforced the need for Russia to maintain strategic depth and flexibility in its military planning. After the victory in Avdiivka, Russian forces adopted a more flexible approach, applying pressure across the front to identify weaknesses and exploiting them with precision strikes. This led to steady gains, with 6 towns and 12 urban settlements recaptured by the end of 2024. Moscow increasingly relied on guided bombs, drones, and small mobile assault units to methodically dismantle Ukrainian defenses. By the end of the year, the pace of the Russian advances had accelerated to levels not seen since early 2022. The culmination of this approach was the Kurakhove operation, covering an area of 1,200 square kilometers. Russia's offensives stretched Ukraine's resources thin, creating simultaneous crises on multiple fronts, from Pokrovsk to Kupiansk and beyond. This multi-pronged strategy exploited Ukraine's logistical and manpower shortages, forcing Kiev to make difficult choices about where to allocate its dwindling resources. The use of precision-guided munitions, including large aerial bombs and hypersonic missiles, played a significant role in these operations. Russian forces systematically targeted Ukrainian command centers, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, disrupting their ability to mount coordinated defenses. Meanwhile, the integration of drones for reconnaissance and strike missions allowed Moscow to maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. By the year's end, Russian forces had established a clear momentum. The combination of tactical innovation, superior artillery, and effective use of drones enabled steady territorial gains. However, this intensity of operations also placed significant strain on Russian logistics and manpower, raising questions about the sustainability of the current approach. By the end of 2024, Ukraine's armed forces faced their worst situation since the war began. With severe shortages of weapons and manpower, rising desertions, and dwindling morale, they struggled to counter Russia's growing momentum. Meanwhile, Moscow's strategy of exhaustion appeared to be bearing fruit, with steady territorial gains and a methodical approach to attrition. Looking ahead to 2025, the key question is whether Russia can maintain its intensity with its current, and quotations, voluntary expeditionary framework. If not, the Kremlin may need to consider mobilizing additional resources, both on the front as well as at home. Alternatively, the West may push for a ceasefire, but Moscow has made it clear that it will not accept anything short of a favorable resolution. For now, Russia's strategy remains clear: keep applying pressure, and sooner or later Ukraine's defenses will collapse. Whether this approach leads to a decisive victory or a protracted stalemate will depend on the ability of both sides to adapt and endure in the face of mounting challenges. But so far, in 2025, it seems that Ukraine is unable to counter the Russian frontline strategy. Having covered the various battles in Donetsk like Pokrovsk and Kurakhove and Toretsk in the last video, today I will focus on the Luhansk sector, particular attention being paid to the breakthrough at Lyman. The front line is already 2 kilometers from Kupiansk. The situation near the city itself is very complicated. This was stated by the head of the Kupiansk City Military Administration, Andrei Besedin, to RBC Ukraine. According to him, the Russians are constantly trying to carry out assault operations. Just yesterday, he said, there were more than 12 operations in the direction of Petropavlovka and Golubovka. This direction belongs to the central part of the city of Kupiansk. In quotations, the enemy is trying to get to the main highway, the Savatove-Kupiansk road, and then to get to the city itself. The situation on the direction of the Zagrizovo, Lozova, Krugliakovka is also very difficult. There, the enemy is constantly conducting assaults to reach the left bank of the Oskil River, Besedin added. But by far the most alarming news for the Ukrainian armed forces comes from the Lyman front. Since mid-October, Russian forces began an active assault on the village of Terny, aiming to cross the Zerabets River and establish a bridgehead on its right bank. Despite this, Ukrainian troops from the 60th Brigade managed to hold the Russians back, preventing the occupation of Terny and further advancement southward to Yampolivka. However, Russian troops managed to cross the river further south, first establishing a bridgehead near Ivanivka, then fully capturing the village and even attempting to advance westward. Currently, the Ukrainian armed forces are trying to drive Russian forces out of the right bank, but if they fail, the entire Lyman front will feel the negative consequences. Further north, on the Borova front, Russian troops have finally occupied the village of Lozova, which had been in the gray zone for several weeks. They continue to push along a wide front toward the Oskil River, although in recent weeks, the Ukrainian Defense Forces have managed to stabilize the situation and prevent any further Russian advances. Similarly, the Ukrainian armed forces are holding the defense in the village of Kopanki and are not allowing Russian forces to fully cut off the Borova-Savatove road. Now here I have a very interesting assessment from Ukrainian journalist cum whistleblower Mr. Yuri Butusov on the Lyman breakthrough. The complete absence of replenishments on the Lyman front poses a threat of defeat at a critical moment, was how Mr. Butusov opened his report of the 9th of January. The situation, which requires immediate decisions of the headquarters, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, Mr. Volodymyr Zelensky, the Minister of Defense, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, has developed in the Lyman direction, he said. 2 Russian armies will make great efforts to break through the estuary front. The Russian enemy has used large forces, he said. The Russians have 2 breakthrough sites, both of which are decisive for the fate of the Lyman front. The first section is near the village of Pishani in the Kupiansky district, where the Russian enemy managed to break through to the Oskil River and dissect our positions at the Oskil bridgehead. If the Russian enemy completely captures the border on Oskil, it will allow them to advance by passing Kupiansk and advancing towards Izium. The second section is the village of Terny. The taking of this village will allow the Russians to reach Torske and close the main route of communication with our group in the Suvyansky forest, effectively allowing the Russians to approach Lyman and Yampol. That is, this means the Russians will gain a significant operational advantage and will force the entire Lyman front to retreat in the future. While the Ukrainian command sends tens of thousands of mobilized brigades to other areas, where these brigades are just learning to fight, there were no replenishments on the Lyman front for more than a month. In general, zero, exclaimed Mr. Butusov. Our experienced brigades with at least minimally working headquarters, drones, there is coordination, training, and interaction, for some reason, left infantry without replenishments at all. There was a situation when everyone who was able to hold a weapon was thrown into battle. Moreover, our frontiers are favorable to us and the Russians are forced to attack head-on. And frequently, soldiers and sergeants call me to ask why do we give up such important positions that could be effectively defended under certain conditions. But for experienced brigades and for the protection of the Kharkiv region from the east, they cannot find at least 1,000 people for a whole month. At that time, tens of thousands of servicemen as part of 7 newly formed brigades have been sent to southern Donbass in recent months, according to open data in our media and social networks. Yes, those fronts need these men, but you can't leave other important areas of the front without attention at all. Can the Lyman front be lost at a time when the army has obvious reserves, he asks? Will we lose the opportunity to defeat another Russian offensive in this direction and inflict losses on the Russians due to the lack of attention and elementary organizational decisions? Does anyone not understand this? These were the questions Mr. Butusov posed to his audience. The situation, he says, requires immediate solutions. Every hour is important for Ukrainian troops on the estuary front, who are extremely exhausted by months of battle. Immediate replenishments are needed to inflict losses on the enemy and maintain the front. I hope that the country's leadership will immediately consider the situation and make adequate decisions, with the last words in the report from this Ukrainian journalist. Now, for all you war enthusiasts who like to support alternative media or independent journalism like this channel, watch this 2-minute trailer I have created to see all the benefits that you will get from joining the channel membership community. And if you do, I welcome you to the exclusive community of WIP's channel, Alternative Media.